Hello, everybody. My name is MJ the Tutor, and you are listening to another episode of Accounting Makes Sense, an MJ the Tutor podcast. This podcast is focused on helping accounting students all over the world by offering a quick warm up on various accounting and business topics that hopefully leads to the generation of bigger discussions and conversation. For all those studying or thinking about doing CIMA right now, this is for you. In today's episode, I thought we'd address a couple of frequently asked questions about the CIMA case study exams. If you remember, or if you had the chance to go through my past episodes, you will have come across something similar that I did in March of 2022, where I also answered some burning questions at the time. I'd link that episode on the show notes so you can access it as well. But I just thought that it was time to do another one. This time, I actually want to focus a little bit more on exam writing tips and hints. Most of these hints and tips are available on the CIMA website. Generally, you can find them on the examiner's report, which are issued after every exam session. So my purpose here, although it's almost a repeat of what they're saying, is to try and break it down for you. Maybe offer some reasons as to why some of it is important to be done in a certain way, and hopefully you don't fall into the same pitfalls. Additionally, I know if you're a first-time case study exam taker or writer, it's really very difficult to separate that concern or anxiety over what you'll be facing on exam day. Sometimes you may just need that reassuring and supporting voice to help you with your burning questions. So here goes. Let's do our FAQs about the CIMA case study exams 2024 version.
Number 1.
If the exam question is given 45 minutes, how much of an answer am I supposed to write? Can you give me a number of words to aim for? So the answer to that is that it's generally not advisable to fixate on a specific word count when crafting your answers. The length of your answer doesn't necessarily correlate with its effectiveness and the quality of your answers. Consider this. Aiming for a word count target doesn't prevent you from repeating yourself or providing incorrect information, just so you can meet the target without necessarily earning the full marks for the question. Using word count as a metric can be very misleading. It's akin to, like having a checkbox that you are ticking off without necessarily ensuring that there's substance to your answer. You might reach that desired word count and feel satisfied, so it's like false hope, even though your answer lacks depth or accuracy, thereby not earning you great marks. Furthermore, the weighting of the exam questions can further complicate matters. So for instance, if you give yourself the word limit of 1,000 words per exam question, and the weighting is uneven, let's say it's a 40-60 split, it becomes challenging to allocate your word count proportionally to each requirement. If you have this 1,000 words per exam question limit, you do 400 words for the 40% section and 600 words for the 60% question. On paper or in your mind, it actually seems ideal because yes, you should write more in the 60% section because that has more marks. But in having said that, limiting yourself by word count kind of hinders you from making your thoughts flow more fluidly. Writing your answers more fluidly. And hence, it's a lot harder to actually narrow it down to a word count. Your focus should be to understand and fulfill the specific requirement. Your focus should be prioritizing developing your answers. Try to be more clear, more concise, try to explain your points and arguments better. That's what you should be aiming for. Just because you reach that level or word count doesn't mean that you're going to pass.
Number 2.
So, exam weighting has been mentioned. Sometimes it's hard for students to write answers and consider the length. If a question is 40-60 weighting, but I feel that there's more to write in a 40% section than a 60% section. Would it be okay to write more for the 40% section and still get a good mark? So the answer there is sure. You could maybe still get a good mark, but there's a reason why the weighting is given and why you should be following it. The problem with disregarding the weighting of exam questions is that you might limit your potential to earn more marks than you otherwise could have. CIMA encourages candidates to consider the weighting when determining how much detail to provide in their answers. For instance, in a question with a 40-60 split, it's expected that the section representing 60% of the marks will require more depth and detail than the 40% section. I think that's obvious, right? Because the 60% section would carry more marks. So let's say you are eligible to get 25 marks for this whole question. This means the 40% section, you can get 10 marks for it. And the 60% section, you can get 15 marks for it. Now, even if you write extensively for the 40% section, you'll still only be eligible for a maximum of 10 marks. So if you allocate more time to that section, because you know the topic well and you can write more for it, you could potentially be sacrificing what you could write for 60% section. Because think about it, you only have limited time. So you gotta split it correctly, or you gotta use that time effectively to earn you the best possible mark. And if you overspend on the lower weighted section, you are compromising your ability to adequately address the higher weighted section within the time frame. So don't ignore the given weighting.
Number 3.
On a case study exam, I encountered a question about analyzing a new business environment for the pre-scene company. I wrote everything I knew about environmental analysis and gave many different models like Pastel, 5 Forces, Porter's Diamond. My answer was really long and a lot, and I really expected to get full marks for this. Is that the correct way to approach a question? So the answer to that one is a little bit tricky. While we want students to showcase that they know what they know about a certain topic, you also shouldn't really just dump everything that you know onto the paper or the answer. So a lot of students risk undermining themselves when they do this at the exam. They look for a keyword in the task, which gives them an idea of what the theory or topic is for that particular question. So the question then goes on and just goes over the top with it, regardless of whether it's really relevant information or not. So for instance, in your example, you mention environmental analysis, and you feel compelled to discuss the various environmental analysis tools and models that you know about, even if the question may only have specifically asked for the application of one model. So in such cases, it's imperative that you adhere closely to the task's instructions. If one model is asked for, then one model it is. If a specified model is asked for, then use that specific model. There's no need to inundate the response with extra information or alternative models to demonstrate proficiency in that particular topic. This scattergun approach is, where you shoot and you see what sticks, suggests that you lack clarity and you lack understanding regarding the task at hand, so thereby eroding the credibility of your answer. It's really crucial to remain focused and ensure that every aspect of your answer directly addresses the requirements outlined in the question. Conversely, if the task requests a comparison of 2 different models or tools, you should feel confident introducing a second model. Similarly, if specific tools are mentioned in the question, you can use those mentioned for the purposes of strengthening your response. A more targeted approach ensures that the answer remains aligned with the task's objectives, thereby enhancing credibility at your end and effectiveness in gaining the right marks.
Number 4.
On a case study exam, I encountered a question about ratio analysis. I had to do simple calculations to explain the movements of specific ratios, whether some of them were going up and going down. I don't understand what else to add here. Am I missing something? So, the answer there is merely observing changes in ratios without providing deeper analysis will likely result in limited marks. Simply indicating whether a ratio is increasing or decreasing merely informs the examiner of its directional movement without really offering a conclusive explanation. Typically additional context within the question prompts students to delve deeper into their analysis. So for example, or for instance, in a scenario comparing company A and company B, focusing on a specific ratio like the gearing ratio requires more than stating that company A has a higher gearing ratio than company B. This is very superficial. The observation adds little value, and the examiner could really get this information just by reading the question as well. Instead, what you should be doing is to provide contextual insight, such as, you need to acknowledge that company A's gearing ratio, X percentage, exceeds that of company B, Y percentage, potentially indicating there is a heavier reliance on debt financing on company A's operations. While leveraging debt can be advantageous up to a certain point, exceeding it poses risks. Therefore, if we're considering an investment in company A, we should diligently monitor its gearing ratio to see and prevent excessive risk exposure. Failure to maintain a prudent balance could render company A less desirable as an investment opportunity for us. Does that not sound better? Right? You provide an explanation as to why the gearing ratio has moved, and you're providing an insight as to the possibilities and what we should do about it. So that's the type of answers that examiners are looking for. Not just simply pointing out the obvious or the information that's already been given, because that adds nothing to the conversation. You should provide a little bit more insight at your end so that they can see that you understood what is happening to the business.
Number 5.
I've seen comments from the examiner's report talking about avoiding the use of bullet points, or that we should write out our answers in paragraphs. Normally, we do this, but since it's a time-pressured exam, sometimes we don't get to do this. And to save time, we tend to just write out some of the answers in bullets. Why is this wrong? What is up with that? So, the answer to this one is that there's a little bit of a challenge when using bullet points in answers that specifically look for paragraphs, because the risk there is that students tend to condense their answers to the extent that it becomes incomprehensible to the examiners. So consider the scenario. Imagine you're tasked with discussing the balance scorecard, BSC, but time constraint forces you to resort to listing its four perspective in bullet points. So you're going to put in your bullets: customer, internal business process, learning, financial. Now, put yourself in the examiner's position. If you had just seen this answer where there's just a list of these perspectives without really elaboration or indication of their relevance to the question, would you give the mark? What mark are you going to give? 1 mark for each bullet, whereby you don't even know what the student wants to do with those bullets? So that's where the problem is. It lacks clarity as to what you're going to do with those bullets. Now, doesn't mean to say that you can't use bullets. You can use bullets, but it would have been more effective, I'd say, if you express each point in full sentences. At least there's a indication of what you're going to try and do there. So again, for instance, articulating that customer perspective is vital to the BSc because it involves assessing customer retention, which could provide much needed context, right? It actually tells you what that customer perspective is. And if you have more time or additional time, you could still expand on that by explaining how feedback and surveys are used within this perspective to gauge market penetration and customer satisfaction levels. So in that way, you can see, even though you've used a bullet, that you were able to explain what you're going to be using with that bullet point or with that bulleted word. And that's it, only 5 for this version, but really long ones, as opposed to the 10 that I did in 2022. I really like this format of having a list of questions and addressing them, so I think I'm really going to do this from time to time in some of my future episodes. I suppose if you've visited my website, you may have already noticed that it is a bit like a teacher-student column. Anyways, if you do have questions, you can reach out to me through the website or here on the podcast. Thank you for listening to Accounting Makes Sense, an MJ the Tutor podcast. As always, I am your host, MJ. If you're keen to connect to be updated with the arrival of the next episode of this podcast or find CIMA resources online, please head on over to my website, www.mjthetutor.com. You can also hit subscribe on whichever platform you are using to listen to this podcast. If you want to connect on social media, I'm on Facebook, X, and Instagram under the name MJ the Tutor. So, I hope to see you again next time. Ciao for now!